Today we're going to be talking about a specific famous development studio, so you can probably already predict what the first paragraph of this vid is going to entail, right?
Before we start the vid, we gotta do the thing where we recap the dev's history to get that extra bling. Talk about their games and stuff you already know, so I can look like I know my shit and we can segue into the show. Hey! Ba-ba-ba-ba-ba.
Over the course of Generation 7, Platinum Games slowly built up a stellar reputation with their diverse, polished, and eccentric action games that struck a chord with players on a variety of different systems. Formed from a plethora of ex-developers from the defunct Clover Studio, known for their work at Capcom on Beautiful Joe, Okami, and God Hand, Platinum soon found their feet with beloved titles such as Bayonetta and Vanquish. The developer really started attracting some more mainstream attention though when they got their hands on the Metal Gear license and developed the over-the-top hack-and-slash Metal Gear Rising, which entered the gaming zeitgeist with its incredible boss fights and iconic quotes and banter that the kids still meme it up with to this day. Lately though, things have been getting a bit rocky with some poorly received titles. So today I want to take a look at where they stand at the moment and whether the state of their current output should have us worried about the future. The first game that Platinum released that raised a few eyebrows in terms of its subpar quality was The Legend of Korra. Based on the fake anime of the same name, it felt like the first title they made to be a bit phoned in. While it had a few fun combat mechanics, it was overall short, fairly shallow and repetitive, with pretty simplistic visuals. It was clearly a very low-budget Platinum production. One of the central mechanics was just the use of a counter similar to that of Metal Gear Rising's. Along with that lack of novelty, we also got the usual Platinum niggles that even its great games struggle with, such as awkward, unrebindable controls. You know, if when you say the word awkward and it sounds awkward, that's just the worst, isn't it? Their next licensed game, Transformers Devastation, was a lot better, but again, outside of a few moves, the main combat mechanics felt like they were just mostly lifted from other Platinum titles. This time, instead of featuring the Metal Gear counter, it decided instead to use the time-distorting dodges of Bayonetta. It took me a long time to actually pick up Devastation, partly due to my disinterest in the subject matter, but also because if I wanted to play around with Bayonetta's mechanics, I'd just put in Bayonetta again. With these two titles, it was starting to look like maybe Platinum was running the risk of just copying its most popular moves from its older games and strapping them on to other IPs, creating a standardized kind of template they can use for a bunch of different properties. And sure, yeah, there are minute mechanical differences hidden under the bonnet of these games that separate them from the titles they're derivative of, but a few different moves bolted onto the same template is not what Platinum used to be known for. Bayonetta, Mad World, Wonderful 101, these games all had completely different feeling gameplay at their core, and that's not even mentioning Vanquish, which was a third-person shooter unlike anything else they've made. While Platinum was starting to run the risk of becoming a bit more stagnant at this point, at least the games they were making were still good and fun to play. I could imagine even being pretty hyped for Devastation if I cared about old 80s cartoons. What I don't think people were expecting was for some of their games to get straight up bad, as we've seen with the recent awkward releases of both Star Fox Zero and TMNT Mutants in Manhattan. While you may see people chucking around the defense that Platinum didn't have much to do with Star Fox and it was all Nintendo's fault, the info on what Platinum did on Zero is way sketchier than that and seems to lean more towards them being pretty involved. It's all a bit funny to see people getting hyped for Platinum making Star Fox, only for the game to turn out not to be very good, causing a sudden apologist force to crop up trying to convince people they had barely anything to do with it, man. Hashimoto, the director of Bayonetta 2, said the two teams were pretty tightly knit, Platinum handling most of the visual elements and putting their action game expertise into practice. He talked favorably about the controls, and overall, even if we don't know which bad ideas Platinum may have been specifically responsible for here, they were still in a room with whoever was. So I'm still gonna complain about the game, sorry about that. The controls in Star Fox Zero are bad, but I think the discussion about the controls has clouded up the real disappointing thing about the game, which is that at its core, without the wacky new interface, all it is yet another remake of Star Fox in HD, with a few little tweaks. It's another Nintendo franchise the Big N clearly don't know what to do with, so instead of trying to create a brand new game, they just opted to remake an old one and play it safe. You know, it's funny because if the controls were just normal, I feel like people would be just as disappointed by getting basically the exact same game again. And maybe that's why they chose to force such a contrived shooting system down our throat, to disguise the fact that we're just getting the same game again. When things are contrived and overly cumbersome, there's a knee-jerk reaction to defend something immensely stupid like the Star Fox controls, you know, trying to paint them as complex and designed for skilled players. Controls by themselves are rarely ever the core of depth. mechanics are, and controls are simply a tool we use to interface with those mechanics. Unless you're going for some super realistic grounded game where you play as some useless dude who can barely aim for the sake of immersion, there is nothing realistic about aiming a spaceship's guns with a tablet. The ability to aim should not in and of itself be part of the game's difficulty. This is the issue with trying to base your game's depth around the controls. Mechanics can be flawed, but even if they occasionally are, that doesn't cripple the game. If your controls are flawed, even if just a tiny bit, maybe even 90% of the time they work, maybe they work 99% of the time, you're still dealing with a broken game if they have the chance of failing you. And trust me, Star Fox works way less than 90% of the time. Maybe if the controls need an entire button to recenter the pointer when it deviates off screen because the aiming is solely in relation to where the player is holding the controller, aka there's a button on the controller dedicated to trying to fix the controls, there's some work to be done. Okay, let me just quickly explain how these controls don't really work, but maybe give the illusion of depth to some people. In the original Star Fox games, the player shoots in front of the ship with no independent aiming controls. That means the player has to be in front of the enemy, in danger, to fire away, which makes the game about maneuvering in and out of harmful space to let off shots. In Star Fox Zero, you can tilt the controller to aim independently, much like games like Sin and Punishment, only in that game aiming is really easy and intuitive, and in Star Fox Zero, aiming around the screen is super cumbersome, but the fact that it is super cumbersome and really hard to aim at anything and keep moving around makes it feel like there's something to master here, when really there'd be nothing to master if you were just controlling this reticle with an analog stick, a Wii pointer, or even a stylus. And on top of that, sometimes what you're aiming at doesn't correlate to what the target's actually on because only the reticule on the first-person touchscreen is accurate to what the player is trying to point at. So the only way to aim with absolute certainty is to take your eyes off the TV and look down at a small monitor in your hands to see what's going on. This is not to mention other vehicles that control like absolute bollocks, like the chicken robot where the aiming dead zone is so wide you have to drag the pointer across half the screen to get it to turn, unlike in most games with a mouse or analog stick where there is no dead zone and the character will pivot with any slight movement of the pointer. And it all just adds up to being a big huge turd of innovation for the sake of innovation mess that hides the fact that you just paid 40 quid to play Star Fox 64 again. And since this is Platinum and Nintendo, the two kings of never offering fully customizable controls, we're just stuck like this, unable to choose for ourselves how we want to play. Then there's TMNT, which I don't think anybody expected to be as painfully mediocre as it was. It started off on a bad foot pretty early for being a fast-paced hack and slash capped at 30 frames per second. The game's visuals don't really look that taxing for this to be the case, even with the 4 players. You'd think that PS4 and Xbox One could handle this a little higher looking at some of the games that run at 60 on those platforms. The crazy part though is that even the PC version was somehow locked at 30. Remember when Platinum were like the saviors of hack and slash? Because I'll tell you now, even DMC Devil May Cry had an uncapped frame rate at least on PC when that came out. The game itself is a distillation of everything that has been getting played out in Platinum's games. Yep, dodge at the right time and get a special attack, do some parrying, mash the 2 attack buttons, fall asleep. It just doesn't have much of an original spark at all. The few things it chooses to do differently just seem needlessly aggravating. Parrying and dodging is all mapped to the same button, which is unwieldy to say the least. Not that you'd really want to parry that much though, considering how little it really helps. I tried practicing it a bit for this video to try and confirm if it had much use, but that was hard to do considering how much the other turtles kept getting in my way and stealing my kills. I mean, sometimes they listen to commands, but not often. God help you really doing anything specific in this ocean of animations and effects when the whole team is attacking. The moment-to-moment gameplay is quite tedious, by-the-numbers objectives where you sit around waiting for computers to be hacked or party members to escort an item. Unfortunately, objectives aren't the only thing you'll be spending time waiting on. A lot of the moves run on these MMO-style timers, so instead of using a variety of attacks and tricks in your moveset to be on the offensive at all times, a lot of playtime is just spent waiting for the super attack to recharge and your quick select or some buff to become active, and that just isn't dynamic, waiting for moves to come back. You don't earn this shit by fighting like with a devil trigger, you can just wait. I don't really want to buy moves here because I'm also buying a lot of waiting as well. And the camera system, oh boy does TMNT continue the annoying lack of control options in Platinum games with a vengeance. Don't you worry, I've got a very petty story to back this up with, just sit tight you little monsters. You see, when moving a camera in third person, you know, there's a bit of debate as to what inverted really means. I know this debate must exist because in Bayonetta, inverted can controls do the opposite of what they do in TMNT. In our little Turtle Game's non-inverted setting, pushing left makes an imaginary pointer move left. But looking at the screen, that could also give the impression the camera's moving right. Okay, well fair enough, there's an inverted option here, just pick the one you like, right? No. In TMNT, you can go into this over-the-shoulder shooty mode where there is a pointer on the screen, which to me a lot of folks wouldn't want to have inverted, but maybe they do want to have the normal third-person controls inverted because it feels right to hold right and see the camera move in that direction to show you left. Or maybe you want the exact opposite, maybe you want the regular controls to not be inverted and you want the pointing to be inverted. I mean, who's to say? But guess what? You can't because they're tied to the same goddamn inverted options, when there should be two for each kind of aiming like in previous games you've made, Platinum. This may sound petty, but it's just basic features being ignored and it's getting a bit tiresome, you know, I'm talking about it in my video about video games, it's gotta be getting out of hand. And what are these behind the shoulder shooting modes even doing in these hack and slashes anyway? They never look cool or stylish and they just slow things down. In TMNT they also have the magic ability to let you just float in the air for no reason, you know? It's like, what is going on here, man? I know there are people out there who probably like these two games or all the games I've mentioned and don't consider Platinum to be on the decline. But with that said, it's clear people have become divided. You know, there are probably some people out there who don't like any of their games, you know, people who don't like fun. But a few years ago, it was pretty normal that if you liked one Platinum game, you liked them all. They were all great. Say what you want about Anarchy Reigns, but that soundtrack makes it worth the price of admission alone. It's what used to make Platinum so unique, how all of their games managed to please mostly everyone and made them that legendary developer who you knew would provide a fun ride no matter what game their logo appeared on. And they're definitely not that anymore. Platinum Games' big titles have never been the best sellers, so obviously these shorter licensed titles are being used to turn a profit based off their IP by making a quicker game that takes less time and resources. But even if that's the strategy, it's no excuse for making a subpar game, and we shouldn't be putting up with bad products as some kind of sacrifice for the bigger games that we care more about. So how does this actually affect the future, Charlie? Is this video actually just you pontificating on a bunch of Platinum games you don't like that much? Well, listen here, dear viewer, because I have the rap. Nier 2 looks like it will be a light, fast-paced hack and slash like Metal Gear Rising, and so far looks visually pretty impressive. Their highest quality looking game since Bayonetta 2. Even if the game does turn out to have problems, it's still being directed by Yoko Taro, the creator of Drakengard and the original Nier. So if there are problems, it might just be some meta, on purpose stuff. Oh yeah, based Kojima does it again, boy! In terms of Scalebound, Kamiya has only directed 2 games at Platinum, and they've both been distinct titles. Wonderful 101 having an entirely unique and complex battle system. Scalebound looks like it will be going for more of an adventure game RPG style as opposed to a strictly combat-focused game. So maybe this is the shake-up they need to make their lineup a little more original again. As for any more licensed games, I hope that the more severe backlash to TMNT results in Platinum taking note and putting more time into upcoming releases like this. I may have been lukewarm on Transformers or Korra, but I'm pretty sure everyone is puzzled by the release of TMNT being in the state that it is. In conclusion, I think the last thing I want them to do is to stick too much to what's expected of them, or worse, become a self-parody. I think they're starting to really phone in a lot of what used to make for their most legendary moments, and that's something that worries me. There was this interview before the release of Korra where the producer was talking about how the final boss has Platinum Games written all over it. Ooh.
動くような我々らしいラストボスも用意しています。楽しみにしてください。
And yeah, sure, it was a big ridiculous boss that you fight in a scary mad arena, but it just, felt like it was just put there to be the crazy Platinum final boss. I want more legendary Platinum moments like they've done before, but it's not going to work if it just becomes a formula or something they have to do to be quirky. Platinum was such a novelty last gen because mixed in with an otherwise pretty stagnant few years, they were always surprising us with some mad new title. If they become complacent, they'll cease to be that, and as one of my favorite developers, that's the last thing I want. Not every game they make necessarily needs to be a technical hack and slash with parries and witch time capped off with an epic exaggerated final boss. Platinum have their heart in the right place. They're basically in the AAA market right now and they still just want to make fun games above all else, which unfortunately will always make them stand out at the moment. I'm still optimistic about their upcoming games, but for now they've definitely been demoted from what used to be one of the only companies that I'd buy a game off of simply if their logo graced the box. And losing one of those is a real shame.
So we actually really wanted to do local couch co-op, but the problem is if you do, then you have to split the screen, and suddenly your 60 FPS situation gets a lot worse.